And welcome to Dateline London, the programme which brings together international correspondents filing from the UK with the best of BBC expertise. I'm Geetha Gurumuthy. This week we ask, what is Britain's role in the world? With a huge moment of change as we battle a global pandemic and Brexit has become real, there is renewed interest in what the UK's international future looks like. A new government report called Global Britain focuses on the Indo-Pacific, suggesting closer ties with India, Japan and Australia. What does that mean for the relationship with China? A question faced at the moment also, of course, by President Biden. Meanwhile, nations all over the world continue to grapple with their vaccination programmes. What do the diplomatic skirmishes over COVID tell us about where power lies today? With me are Isabel Hilton, founder of China Dialogue, Geoffrey Kaufman, a US-Canadian journalist and former war correspondent with ABC News, and the BBC's chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette. Welcome to everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. Boris Johnson launched a new foreign policy direction, Global Britain, the Integrated Review, this week. It was driven in part by Professor John Bew, a historian known across the political landscape here and author of a much-read biography of Labour's post-war Prime Minister Clement Attlee. Seen in that light, the focus on NATO, a renewed commitment to nuclear and a tilt to the Indo-Pacific with more interest in space, cyber and technology are perhaps unsurprising. Politically, can global Britain be made to chime with the government's other key mantra of levelling up? And what about China? Friend or foe or both? Isabel, let me start with you. Are we already in some sort of Cold War?
Well, we certainly have elements of Cold War, but unlike the original Cold War, we're dealing with not the Soviet Union, but a country that has, second biggest economy in the world and a huge trading partner. So it's more complicated than that. But we are in a systemic confrontation, and a series of reports from the United States, from the European Union, from various Western democratic partners have identified this strategic contest that we are certainly engaged on. So the difficulty that all of these countries are facing is, how do you pursue that systemic confrontation? How do you defend human rights and democratic values whilst continuing to trade with such an important partner? And that's at the heart of this report too. The question isn't answered. Boris Johnson once described his position as wanting to have his cake and eat it, and there's a lot of cakeism in this report without really confronting the question of, is there a cost to defending values, and is Britain prepared to pay it at a time when it's lost its major trading partner, the European Union, and is seeking to compensate for this with patching together new different relationships across the world.
OK, let me bring in Jeff. Do you think this is cakeism, or is it just necessary pragmatism that we are seeing from the UK, from the EU and from the US, who had major talks with China this week?
I think the report itself represents a kind of identity crisis for the United Kingdom in this kind of post-superpower world, post-Brexit world. And where exactly does the United Kingdom fit in? It's not really a major player in any way in global politics, but it has a historic legacy that it wants to sustain. And that's really what the report seems to be trying to reconcile in dropping. In leaving the EU, which represents 43% of this country's trade. It is simply not going to be made up with trade with Japan, which is, 1.9% of this country's trade. And so, I think it's about trying to find that place. I think on the question of China, it is really an irreconcilable challenge for every country. We saw it in Alaska this week. With the standoff of between the American and Chinese diplomats. It was a very, very uncomfortable public display of the kind of antagonisms that now exist. America lecturing China, China lecturing America, and I think Britain is caught in the same kind of conundrum. You can't ignore China.
Lise, Geoffrey saying that the UK isn't an international player anymore, but the UK is still on the Security Council. We're still a really big military contributor in Europe and to NATO, of course. Is that a fair analysis? Because this is attempting to say, look, Britain is in a new place and this is how we see our future.
This review was absolutely fundamental. Jeffrey called it a identity crisis. You could even say existential crisis. Yes, Britain is on the UN Security Council. How does it justify its position? For a long time, it was known as the go-to power for the United States whenever it wanted to engage in costly and risky military engagements in decades past. Or it was the bridge to Europe. Who do you call up if you'd like to talk to someone that you know speaks the same language when you want to talk to Europe about something? And now Britain post-Brexit needs a new place in the world. And the language of this report is very interesting. Gone is that phrase, much beloved of Scandinavian nations, middle power. Gone is that phrase we always used to use about Britain punching above its weight. They talk about shaping the international order. And of course, they've had to look to what are Britain's strengths. So looking at science, looking at technology, and Britain, of course, looking to this idea of the Indo-Pacific tilt. You began by asking, Isabel, is this a new Cold War? I don't think so. I don't know what Jeffrey and Isabel, the Cold War, to be really crude, was driven by ideology. This is driven by interests. India and China are the two most populous countries in the world, both of them almost 1.4 billion people. Of course, you're going to want to trade with those countries, have relations with those countries, but we are back to that juggling act that it seems to me it's always been there. How do you weigh up your values versus your interests? And I think in this new paper, we're seeing that interest are tilting more than values. There was that video that was leaked of Dominic Raab basically telling people, well, if we had to decide who we trade with based on their human rights records, we wouldn't be trading with all of the great growth markets. So as someone said, it's very honest. It's realpolitik. It is the world we live in it today. It is that British expression, we are where we are.
And Isabel, if there is a real push from the US, Europe, to back up India, which is the other big superpower, I guess, and Japan, Australia, etc., is it possible that that can really provide a counterbalance to the growing might of China? Because it has spread its influence in so many ways across the world, hasn't it?
Well, there's a confusion between, the strategic need for the Quad, if you like, and the economic weight of China. And I disagree with the characterization that it's about we are where we are. It's a lot of it is about we are where we were. There's a lot of invocation of past influence and past virtues, most of which are really divergent with current policy. So there's a lot of bragging about soft power and cultural power and the reach of the BBC. Well, we know what the government's, doing to the BBC. It's closed down BIFID and merged it with the Foreign Office, which was, a huge bit of soft power. It's cut aid to the most vulnerable country in the middle of a crisis. All of these, there is a divergence between the picture presented in this report. And
just let me quickly bring Lise in on the BBC for a pure bit of self-interest for a moment.
I think maybe Isabel and I don't agree. Maybe we are where we are is the same as we are where we were, because in comes Britain with its baggage of all its, its former colonial relationships, all of the history, the BBC, all that weight of history. As it moves forward, it is carrying those bags as it travels to new regions of the world, as it looks to what it is described as the new geopolitical center of the world, which it sees as Indo-Pacific, in the same way that the United States is seeing that part of the world. Anthony Blinken and Jake Sullivan's first visits were to Japan and South Korea. Their first meetings were with the Chinese in Alaska. So they're also saying something. So it's interesting that the United States and Britain are still moving in the same direction.
And just let me bring Jeff in. I mean, when you look at the way that US and Canadian media and so on look at the UK's role now, obviously Brexit sort of galvanised everybody here, but it does throw up legitimate questions about how much the UK matters and how useful it is to that old US allegiance.
I think it's a fair question, and I think that moving away from Europe has really diminished the UK's power and presence in this debate in the eyes of the US and Canada. People can't quite understand, at least on some sides of the political spectrum, what's gone on. you know, I think that right now, candidly, the thing that you're seeing most is this awe of. I know we're going to talk about it in a moment, the way the UK has distributed vaccines. I think that that's really eclipsed everything else because the UK just seems to be bumbling and stumbling and everything. And that's kind of dominated now the discourse about the UK outside of the UK.
Yeah, we will come on to vaccines in a moment. Isabel, I just want to ask about the whole focus on cyber space and so on, because we have seen in recent years that is a focus of real concern. Does this paper, you know, give the UK and others enough protection? Do you think there is enough focus from democratic nations on protecting ourselves on that front?
It does certainly talk about investment and commitment to, you know, developing capacity. In Britain, you know, is no slouch when it comes to cyber, but it does need investment. And historically, we have underinvested in the whole science and technology area. We're very good at inventing and very bad at supporting inventions to market and therefore, you know, retaining the value of them. So there are quite structural issues here that for Britain to be the kind of have the domestic resilience that it's going to need to cope with being adrift as a small, medium-sized power in a very, very contentious world. You know, we're going to have a lot of, we're going to need a lot of attention to domestic issues. And it's not straightforward to say we can just put material interests ahead of human rights when it comes to China, because we also proclaim our close friendship with the United States, which is involved in a systemic confrontation. So when it comes to choosing, and there will be moments when we have to choose, what will Britain choose? We're sending an aircraft carrier to the Far East. What's it going to do? Would it defend Taiwan? Is it just doing freedom of operations in the South China Sea? Well, you know, China doesn't like that either. So all of these choices are going to come up repeatedly, and I don't get the sense from this paper that the direction is clear enough for us to make those properly.
Jeff, and that's been one criticism, that, you know, still the UK is making choices on a sort of issue-by-issue basis as moments arise, rather than having some kind of definite, clear strategy.
Oh, I think so. I think there's a lot of, we talked about it earlier, cakeism. You know, yes, we want to have a global presence, but we're cutting back foreign aid. We're not going to meet our targets. Yes, we want to be a power on the international stage, but we're going to diminish our military here in the UK. You know, there is a kind of wistfulness of where we want to be and what we're willing to be.
Lise, just final word to you on this one. There's still a lot of detail to come out on defence budgets and so on. And one political question that has been raised is whether this sort of global Britain idea can be linked with levelling up, because this government, the Conservative government here, has got a huge mandate, and it's trying to shift the dial and bring the public with it, obviously.
It's a huge challenge. It's a huge challenge for every single country coming out of this global pandemic. And as we'll be discussing, with Europe reeling from a third wave, no one is out of the woods yet. No one knows yet what is going to be the economic impact of this pandemic, and it's whether it's going to have to really cut a lot of ambitions down to size. I mean, Jeffrey mentioned about the cut in the aid budget. Well, Boris Johnson said, well, this is temporary. When we return to fiscal strength, we will resume our role. But of course, in the aid community, Britain has always been seen as a leader when it comes to funding of education, etc., funding to places like Yemen, where the aid has been cut by nearly 50%. 2/3 of aid to Syria has been cut. If you lose that reputation, that standing, if you like, do you ever return to it? Is it possible to return to it, both in financial terms as well as in terms of your global prestige? These are really defining moments.
Yes, I guess it's where the politics and where votes are for this government, and whether people care about cutting aid or not, because it's politically
domestic
popular,
interests
isn't it?
we'll hear about that in the vaccine, is that no matter how much you talk about the global public good, you have to make sure your mother, your grandmother, your sisters, your father, your family, your street are vaccinated first.
Yeah.
Your voters.
Okay, we are beautifully linked there by Lise. We're coming on to vaccines, because the story story of AstraZeneca surely shows how interlinked we are all. Created in a UK university with a British-Swiss company, produced in bulk in India, with constituent parts from the US, the vaccine is in demand around the world, apart from in those European nations who seem unsure as to whether they actually want to use it. Europe is being hit by a third wave of COVID, driven by the UK variant in part, yet seems unable to arrive at a coherent policy. Jeff, has this slightly swayed you in favour of Brexit and away from the idea of an integrated European policy?
That's a cruel question to ask.
Sorry.
But you're right. But you know, listen, it's also a fair question. I think we have to acknowledge that the critics of Europe really can point to what's going on now and say, look, this is an ungovernable beast, the European Union, 27 member countries, but the European Union itself is not a nation, and that's what's been exposed in the absolute failure to address the global pandemic and the vaccine rollout in an efficient manner. The caution, the bureaucracy, the lack of accountability and transparency, all of these things, which candidly were part of the Brexit debate, have been exposed. And there's no question this we talked a moment ago about existential crises. I think Europe has to confront some pretty hard questions about its own ability to deliver what it claims it can. And it has so far failed miserably. And there's a huge amount of anger across Europe about this. But you talked about AstraZeneca. I mean, I think it's also mixed with some anti-British politics around AstraZeneca because it came from Oxford, and some very mixed up medical ethics that say some dubious claims of a handful of deaths amongst millions of people should trump the protection for tens of thousands who may otherwise die.
And Isabel, we are seeing all the fears around vaccine nationalism come out, I think, and yet, you know, the big countries like China and India are still distributing the vaccine, but also under pressure, of course, to protect, in India's case, its own population. Where is the right and wrong here? And it shows a new way of wielding international power, doesn't it, if you are distributing vaccines?
China, this has been another opportunity. Crisis always creates opportunities for China, it would appear. The biggest producer of pharmaceuticals until now has been India. It's been a tremendous strength of India. But India, of course, is also under pressure to vaccinate its populations. China has ramped up its production and is distributing vaccines to a number of countries. And if you look at a country like Chile, for example, which has a high per head of population vaccination rate, it's all Chinese vaccines. So it's having some success in Latin America, in Africa, and in one or two countries in the former Eastern Bloc in Europe. But it has an extraordinarily low vaccination rate at home. Now, this is partly because China has had such a successful lockdown policy that the incidence of the virus is relatively low. So within China's borders, a lot of people are leading rather normal lives, and the demand for the vaccine is therefore relatively low in China. But the problem for China is, well, how do you maintain that if you want to open your borders? So, you know, there is the virtue of being able to return to normalcy, but there is the difficulty of not having, you know, much coming and going with the outside world for the foreseeable future because you haven't vaccinated the population. Okay. So the way the Chinese government has played it is that this is a bid for a global position in global pharmaceuticals, slightly at the expense of its own population.
And Lise, I mean, I guess, you know, some people will be thinking, right, every country should start making their own vaccine, their own masks, their own health protections. What if we have a sort of biochemical attack down the line because we can't trust our neighbours to give us what we want? Is that at all realistic, or are we way beyond that because of globalisation?
It's another one of those defining moments. I think if you had the WHO sitting here or another international agency, they would say this is a really test to the world. Let's all work together. If we all work together, if we had a concerted, coordinated policy of buying up vaccines rather than what we saw, which is a race to buy and wealthier countries paying a lot more just so they could get more, it has turned out to be wise move by a lot of them if they had the resources and the strategic thinking to do that. But yes, it has. I mean, I'm from Canada, and Canada's really behind. It hasn't been able to buy the vaccines that are being manufactured in Europe, even though it ordered them. And many people are saying, why aren't we manufacturing doses in Canada? There was a story on BBC Newsnight last night of a leaked WHO document calling on countries to remove the patents, to let more countries produce them. Only about a third of the vaccines which are needed are now being produced around the world. Of course, the pharmaceutical companies say, listen, you have to have protections in that. You simply can't give it to everyone, to which, of course, the critics say, well, listen, billions of public money has gone into the production of these vaccines. It is unassailably a global public good. This vaccine issue has, like the coronavirus itself, it has shone a light on so many ways in which the world works or doesn't work.
30 seconds, Jeff, if you can, on, is this going to be a new kind of missile, effectively? Who can help? Who has got the manufacturing capacity on the healthcare front?
I think there's no question what Lee said is correct, that countries will start examining their own supply chains. Globalization has failed in this case, and countries will suddenly acknowledge, or start to acknowledge, that they need domestic capacity, even if it's more expensive. The U.S. can supply Canada, as Lee's pointed out, but has until this week refused to give Canada the doses it needs. Canada sold off its domestic manufacturing in the 1980s and in 2000, and is now rapidly scrambling to build its own supply chain. That's going to happen across Europe, across the world, in countries that can afford it.
OK, we've got a very short amount of time to quickly ask everyone for a story that's caught their eye that we might have missed. Lise.
Well, one has fallen completely off the radar. This is the year which marks 20 years since the attacks of September the 11th. A US-led invasion went in to topple the Taliban. Astonishing, the US, 20 years on, is now trying to get out of Afghanistan when the Taliban are on the brink of power. So there was a meeting in Moscow. There will be another meeting in Turkey next month. The US is accelerating diplomacy to try to achieve dignified peace, dignified withdrawal. But it's not getting the attention it deserves.
Lise, this is your long-term interest, we know. We thank you for that. Jeffrey, what's caught your eye that we really should have been talking about?
Well, it is being talked about in the U.S., but I think not so much here, and that is the calm, the quiet on the U.S. political front. I think that this is day 60 of the Biden presidency, and what a difference. The way the temperature has been brought down, the culture wars have been de-escalated. It's utterly fascinating. Biden is the anti-Trump in the way he is projecting. He has done so much. It has really been transformative in 60 days, and yet he has shelved his ego in the process. What a difference.
And Isabel, I'll ask you to bring in your own idea, but the idea of kind of the Boris-Biden linkage, do you think that is going to get any traction going forward?
Well, I hope it's going to improve. It started off rather poorly, and Boris seems to belong to a different political era from Biden, but we'll see. It's a deep relationship.
And Jeff, I mean, how is the UK seen in terms of that? We've got the G7 potentially, haven't we, and the climate change summit here in the UK. Is the US-UK, is there going to be a personality clash, or will everyone just be pragmatic?
I think that there won't be a personality clash. There won't be the hostility that we've seen in the previous regime towards some countries. But I wouldn't want to overstate it either. They're very different politically, culturally, and Biden has veered left since his presidency, and really since, given his track record, he is much more of a progressive than Boris ever wants to be. So politically, culturally, they're very different people.
And Isabel, let me bring in your story that you think we should have been talking more about this week.
Well, I bring you the news that North Korea hasn't gone away. We've seen the exchange of rhetoric, but I hadn't been aware till I picked up on this story that there has been a fantastic drain out of North Korea of aid workers, of UN diplomats, and indeed diplomats of every stripe. One batch of Russians had to leave North Korea on a hand-cranked railway trolley because it was the only way they could get across the border. But the isolation is deepening, and there are signs that a food crisis is coming, and that usually means that North Korea rattles its nuclear cage.
Lise, you cover so much of the globe in your job that it's amazing, isn't it, that Brexit and COVID has sort of drowned out our focus on so many corners of the world, isn't it, just finally?
It begins at home. Everyone has had to focus on their bubble, on their lockdown. Everyone has been looking inwards. But every time they peek out the door or peek down the street, they realize that their health and their wealth depends on the state of the world. I've said this on this program before, no one is safe until everyone is safe. And that is whether it's health or science or the military matters. We are all inextricably linked, for better or worse. And right now, it seems for the worst, but it's not over yet.
And Jeffrey, Isabel, 10 seconds each on, it's almost a year, isn't it, since lockdown here. One sentence on how it's been for you.
Oh, listen, I think that for me, I don't want to talk about me. I think that what's really interesting is it's about the role of government has changed. I think that the attack on government and the push to diminish the role of government in our world really has been paused, because we see that the only solution to something of this scale is government involvement, and the successes around the world really are about governments that have addressed this head on. It is not a private sector solution.
Isabel?
Well, I have no personal complaints, except like everyone else, it's been tedious. But I'm very curious to see how much of the world that we had before COVID actually returns. And I think we are in a huge transition. So let's see.
Isabel?
Just to pick up on Isabel's phrase, crises bring opportunities as well. It's up to all of us to seize them.
Lise Doucette, Isabel Hilton, Jeffrey Coughlin, we have to leave it there. Thank you very much indeed for joining us today. Very grateful to you. Sean Lay is here next week, but from me and the whole team for Dateline, thanks so much for watching. Bye for now.